The overnight shift at that hostel on Burgundy paid $10 an hour cash, and I took it because I was 2 months behind on rent and couldn't get anything else. That was March 2017. I worked the desk from 10 at night to 7 in the morning, 4 nights a week, and most of the job was just sitting under a yellow lamp behind a plexi window while drunk tourists stumbled back from Frenchman Street. The place had 8 rooms on the second floor, shared bathrooms, 1 shower, a kitchen with a hot plate that half worked. It smelled like mildew, and the bleach the day girl used to try to cover the mildew. You could hear the streetcar on Rampart if the windows were open. The guy in room 6 checked in on a Sunday. He signed the book as Peter, no last name, and I didn't push it because half our guests wrote fake names anyway. He was maybe 40, thin, with wire glasses and a canvas duffel that looked heavy for how small it was. Paid for 7 nights in 20s, counted them out on the desk twice, asked if the door had a working lock, and when I said yes, he seemed genuinely relieved. He said please and thank you, held the door for the Australian girl in room 4. Made himself instant coffee at 6 in the morning and washed the mug when he was done, which no one at that hostel ever did. If you'd asked me on Tuesday who was the least of my problems, I'd have said him without thinking. Wednesday night around 1, the kid from room 5 came down to the desk. He was maybe 22, a backpacker from Ontario, and he looked like he hadn't slept. He asked if I could move him. I asked why. He said the guy next door was talking through the wall. I said talking to who? He said that was the thing. Nobody, just talking. Since midnight. Same voice, same tone, no pause for breath that he could hear. He said he'd knocked on the wall twice and it hadn't stopped or even changed. He didn't want to fight, he just wanted a different room. We were full. I told him I'd walk up and check. The hallway on the second floor is narrow, and the light is one of those long, fluorescent tubes that ticks. I remember the tick because I stood outside room 6 for probably a full minute before I put my ear near the door, and all I could hear at first was that tick and the fridge in the kitchen down the hall. Then I heard him. He was talking. Low, level, the way you'd read a grocery list to yourself. I couldn't make out words at first. I leaned closer, my cheek almost against the wood. Names. He was saying names. First name, last name, first name, last name, no pauses between them, no inflection, like he was reading them off a page he'd already read 1,000 times. Rebecca something, a Michael, a name that sounded Vietnamese that I couldn't catch, then another, and he didn't stop, and he didn't slow down. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes. I pulled my phone out and hit record, and held it flat against the door for about 90 seconds. And then I walked back down to the desk, and I sat there with the phone on the counter, and I did not know what to do with what I had. I told the Canadian kid I'd talked to the guy, and he'd said sorry and would keep it down. That was a lie. I gave the kid a pair of foam earplugs from the drawer, and he went back upstairs. Around 4 in the morning, I put my earbuds in and played the recording back. It was clearer than I expected. Peter's voice was soft but very clear, and the names came at maybe 1 per second, sometimes 2. I sat there with a pen, and I wrote down the first 3 I could make out cleanly. I'm not going to write the names here. I'll say the first one was a woman's name, one of those older names you don't hear on people under 60. The second one was a man, common first name, unusual last name, the kind of last name you can Google without wading through 1,000 hits. The third was a teenager's name that stuck to me for some reason. I typed the first one into my phone with the word missing after it. She came up on the second result, a county sheriff's page out of central Pennsylvania, last seen leaving a laundromat in 2013. The photo was a woman in her 60s with short gray hair and a red cardigan. I sat there for a second, and then I typed the second name in. Missing out of a small town in Missouri, 2015. His truck had been found at a rest stop. The third one was a girl, 17, gone from a suburb outside Tacoma in 2011. Her mother ran a Facebook page for her that still got posts on her birthday. I put the phone down, and I did not touch it for a long time. The fridge kept humming. Somebody upstairs flushed a toilet and I flinched. Now, here's the thing I keep coming back to. I could have called the cops right then. I thought about it. I picked up the desk phone and put it down twice. But I kept thinking, what do I say? A guy in room 6 is saying names through a wall, and 3 of them are missing people. They'd send someone, they might not. And if they came and he was just sitting there with a book, or with nothing, and he told them to leave, they'd leave. And then he'd know that I knew. That was what stopped me, the idea that he'd know. So I did nothing. I sat behind the plexi and I watched the front door and I listened. Around 5:30, the talking stopped. I know because I went back up and stood at his door, and there was nothing but the sound of a man breathing slow and even, like a person asleep. He came down at 7:40 in the morning, rested, clean shirt, said good morning, and asked if there was a place nearby to get a real breakfast that wasn't tourist food. I told him about a diner on Esplanade. He thanked me. He walked out into the sun with his hands in his jacket pockets like a man on vacation. I waited until he'd been gone 15 minutes. Then I took the master key off the board and went upstairs. His room was neat in a way that bothered me. The bed was made tight, hospital corners. His duffel was open on the chair, and inside were folded t-shirts and 1 pair of jeans and a shaving kit. No laptop, no phone charger. A paperback western on the nightstand with a bookmark at page 9. The notebook was under the mattress on the side against the wall. Black cover, the kind you buy in a drugstore, cheap. When I picked it up, it was heavier than it should have been, and I realized it was because every page was full. Names, front and back. Small, tight handwriting, blue pen mostly, sometimes black. Some of the names had a little dot next to them, some had 2 dots. A few had a line through them. On some pages, there were dates written in the margin, years going back to the 90s. I flipped through it, standing there. I don't know for how long. My hands were shaking enough that the pages made a sound. I put the notebook inside my jacket. I put the mattress back down. I straightened the bedspread. I locked the door on the way out. I walked back down to the desk, and I sat there with the notebook against my stomach under the jacket. And when the day girl came in at 8, I told her I felt sick, and I left. I did not go home. I sat in a Café du Monde across town with the notebook on my lap under the table, and I typed a message to the FBI tip line on their website on my phone. I wrote what I'd heard through the wall. I wrote about the recording. I wrote what I'd found under the mattress. I gave them the address of the hostel and the room number and the name Peter and a description. I asked what I should do with the notebook. I sent it before I could talk myself out of it. They emailed me back the same afternoon. A short, automatic-looking note saying the information had been received and a case number would be assigned. It asked me to hold on to any physical evidence and said an agent might contact me. An agent called that evening. He was polite and asked me the same questions 3 different ways. He asked me to bring the notebook to the field office on Leon C. Simon the next morning. I did. I handed it to a woman at a desk who put it in a paper evidence bag and signed a receipt for me. That was the last time I saw it. Peter did not come back to the hostel that night, or the next. His week was paid up through Saturday, and he never returned for his duffel, or his shaving kit, or the paperback. On Sunday, the owner cleared the room and threw the bag in the storage closet where lost items sat for 30 days before we tossed them. I called the agent twice that first week. He was cordial and said he couldn't share details of an ongoing matter. I called him again a month later. Same answer. I stopped calling. I quit the hostel job in April. I moved out of New Orleans that summer for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. Or maybe they did. I've stopped being able to tell. Nothing was ever in the news. No arrest that I saw. No press conference. I've Googled Peter and every variation of what he might have looked like, and I've gotten nothing back that fits. I've Googled a couple of the other names I remembered from that recording, and some of them are still listed as missing. The recording is still on my phone. I've moved it from phone to phone for 8 years now. I don't know why I keep it. I don't play it. I just know it's there, sitting in a folder I don't open. 90 seconds of a very calm man in a small, clean room, saying names, one after another, like he was reading them to someone who was waiting to hear them. The call came in at 2:47 a.m., right at the tail end of a slow Tuesday. I remember because I'd just finished a burger from the Crystal on Nolensville Pike and was already thinking about knocking off early. Dispatcher was a woman I'd been working with for about 2 years, Colleen. She ran the after-hours line for a small outfit that covered most of Middle Tennessee. In November 2020, if you got locked out at 3 in the morning anywhere in Nashville, your call probably routed through her. Lock replacement, she said, not a lockout. He wants the whole cylinder swapped. That's unusual at that hour. Most 3 a.m. calls are people standing barefoot on a porch. Planned lock replacements are daytime work, but the customer had paid the after-hours fee already, cash on arrival, so I didn't push it. Address was off Wedgwood Avenue, one of those pre-war brick walk-ups they haven't torn down yet. 4 stories, no elevator, green awning out front. I'd been in that building maybe twice before, both times helping someone break back into their own place after a lost key. I parked on the street and killed the engine. It was cold enough that the windshield had a little skin of frost on it by the time I got out. I remember standing on the sidewalk and looking up at the windows. Only one was lit. 3rd floor, not the one I was headed to. The caller said, Unit 13B. I went in through the front door, which was propped with a folded-up pizza box, and started up the stairs. 1st floor was Units 1 through 4. 2nd floor was 5 through 8. 3rd floor was where things stopped making sense. I hit the 3rd floor landing, and there they were. 13A on my left, 14A on my right. Standard layout, 2 apartments per floor at the front, 2 at the back. But between them, tucked into the wall like someone had shoved it in as an afterthought, was another door, narrower than the others. A little recessed, brass number screwed into the wood at eye level, 13B. I stood there for a second, holding my tool bag. I've worked buildings older than this one. Sometimes you find janitor closets with numbers on them. Sometimes there's a weird half unit above a stairwell where the super lives. Not unheard of. I just noted it and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. The guy who answered was maybe 60, thin. Gray hair combed back the way older men comb it, kind of wet looking. Sweatpants. A flannel over a t-shirt. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and he was holding a mug of something. You the locksmith? He said, not a question. Yeah, you called about the cylinder. He stepped back and let me in. The apartment was normal. That's what I keep coming back to. It was normal. Long hallway with a runner rug, kitchen off to the right, living room straight ahead. A little dining table with 2 chairs, though only one had a placemat. TV on low. One of those late-night infomercials about a knife that could cut through a shoe. There was a smell of coffee and something else. Onions, maybe, like he'd made himself dinner a few hours before. There were photos on the walls. I glanced at them the way you glance at anything in a stranger's house. A younger version of him at what looked like the beach. Him with an older woman, probably his mother. A framed diploma from somewhere I didn't read closely. Front door lock, he said. Deadbolt too if you can do both. I can do both. He handed me an envelope. I didn't open it in front of him, but I could feel it was thick. He watched me for a second, and then went and sat in the living room and turned the TV up a notch. Not loud, just enough that we didn't have to make conversation. I got to work. I'll tell you what got in my head. It wasn't him. He was a normal guy in a normal apartment. It was the door itself, once I started taking it apart. The frame was old. Not just old, like the building. Older. The wood was that dense, dark stuff they used before the war, and the hinges had been painted over so many times the pin barely turned. I've seen doors like this in houses in East Nashville that hadn't been touched since the 40s. But this was a door in a hallway that had clearly been renovated at some point in the 90s. New carpet, newer trim on the other units. This door didn't match anything. The cylinder came out easy enough. I set the new one in and started fitting it. And while I was crouched there, I noticed the wall. The hallway wall next to his door was maybe 5 inches deep. I knew that because I'd stood in Unit 14A once, and I remembered the coat closet just inside their entry. Their closet backed up right against this wall. On the other side, 13A's kitchen. I'd been in that one too. There was no room here. Not for a hallway with a runner rug, not for a kitchen and a living room, not for a man with framed photos and a coffee mug. I actually stopped what I was doing and looked back down the hall the way I'd come, from inside his apartment. The hallway went maybe 20 feet before it opened into the living room. 20 feet of apartment, sitting inside a wall that was 5 inches thick. I want to be honest here. I didn't say anything. I didn't run. I didn't do the thing you'd expect. I just went back to the lock. I've been doing this job long enough to know that when something doesn't add up, the last thing you want to do is start asking. You finish, you get paid, you leave. That's the whole rule. He came over once while I was working, stood behind me maybe 3 feet back. "How long?" he said. 20 minutes. Take your time." He walked back to the couch. I finished the deadbolt first, then the cylinder, tested both with the new keys, handed him one set. He put them in his pocket without looking at them. "The old ones," he said, and held out his hand. I gave him the old keys. He walked into the kitchen, and I heard him drop them in what sounded like a metal drawer. Not a trash can, a drawer. I packed up my tools. He was already back on the couch when I got to the door. He raised the mug slightly, which I guess was his goodbye. I stepped out into the hall, and he closed the door behind me. I heard the new deadbolt turn. I stood on that landing for maybe a full minute. I looked at 13A. I looked at 14A. I looked at the narrow door in between. Then I went down the stairs and out to my van, and I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel, and I didn't move for a while. The next morning, I did something I don't usually do. I looked the building up. Public records for Davidson County are online. I found the parcel, pulled up the floor plans that had been filed with the city, and I scrolled to the 3rd floor. There was no 13B on the plans. There was 13A. There was 14A. Between them, on the drawing, was a solid piece of wall labeled as a chase for the building's plumbing stack, about 5 inches deep. Exactly what I'd expected before I opened the door the night before. I called the management company that owned the building. Told the woman on the phone I'd done a lock change at 13B and wanted to confirm the billing address. She put me on hold for a long time. Then a man got on the line and asked me to repeat what I'd said, very slowly. They didn't have a 13B. They'd never had a 13B. They pulled the tenant list going back to when the current owners bought the building in 1998, and there was no unit by that number. I gave them the address again. I told them about the door. The man on the phone got very quiet. He called me back that evening. He'd gone to the building himself with a maintenance guy, said the door was still there, said they'd knocked and no one answered. He asked if I could send him the invoice, the phone number the customer had called from, anything I had. The number Colleen had taken the call from was a prepaid cell, disconnected by the time we tried it. I heard the rest from a friend of mine who does insurance work for a lot of these older properties. It took the management company almost a month to sort out, and even then, they only sorted the paperwork side. Turns out in 1990, when the building was renumbered after a renovation, somebody at the tax assessor's office had filed a Unit 13B by mistake. A typo, basically. It sat on a form somewhere and nobody caught it. On paper, that unit existed, square footage listed and everything. In reality, the square footage overlapped with parts of the 2 apartments on either side. It couldn't physically be there, but the county had it in the system. For 30 years, nobody noticed. Somewhere along the way, somebody figured out that a unit that officially existed but couldn't be seen was worth something to the right person. A man had been living inside that wall, or rather, inside space carved out of the 2 apartments next to it, for 22 years, paying rent in cash. To who, they never established. The management company had never received a dime. They opened the door 2 weeks after I did. He was gone. So was almost everything in the apartment. The photos, the runner rug, the placemat, the mug. The furniture was still there but had been wiped down, my buddy said. Wiped down like a rental car. The new deadbolt was still on the door. My deadbolt. He'd locked it behind him on the way out. I still take calls in that part of town. I don't turn down work over a bad night. But every now and then, Colleen will read me an address, and I'll wait, just for a second before I say yes, just long enough to make sure I've heard the unit number right. The thing I keep coming back to is that we cut into a man who had already been buried 2 weeks earlier. Not officially. Officially, he was on our table because paperwork said so. But the timeline never lined up, and after a while, nobody wanted to make it line up. I worked as a prep tech at one of the anatomy labs attached to a medical school in Minneapolis. This was August 2018. My job wasn't fancy. I logged donors coming in, checked tags, ran the initial dissections for the first-year students so they'd have something structured to work with when class started in September. A lot of it is just careful, boring work. You wear the double gloves, you keep your radio low, you drink cold coffee, and by the end of the shift, your shoulders are shot from being hunched over a table. The donor came in on a Monday. Male, mid-60s, unremarkable file. Cause of death listed as cardiac. I remember the intake tag because the last name had one of those Scandinavian endings that half of Minnesota still has on the mailbox. I'm not going to write it, doesn't matter. The room I was working in that morning smelled the way it always does. That mix of formalin and lemon-scented industrial cleaner that never really covers the formalin. The vents up top run loud enough that you tune them out after 10 minutes. There were 4 tables prepped. I was on the one closest to the door. I was doing a thoracic opening. Nothing unusual. The sternum came out clean. I was going to lift the anterior wall and then step out for a smoke break before starting on the abdomen. Standard. Then my scalpel hit something that wasn't tissue and wasn't bone. I actually said, "Huh," out loud. There wasn't anyone else in the room to hear it. Sometimes on a body, you'll hit an old surgical clip, a pacemaker lead, a pin from a hip replacement. That's the assumption you make first. So I set the scalpel down and went in with forceps to feel for edges. It was smaller than a pacemaker, maybe the size of a poker chip, thinner, flat. Rectangular on one side, rounded on the other. I lifted it out and set it on a metal tray. It made a very small clink. Under the light, it looked like a piece of a circuit board that someone had tried to seal in resin. There was a coin cell battery on one side, a chip, and a bit of insulated wire wound around itself. Not a medical device. Nothing with a serial number I recognized. It had been placed inside a bag of what used to be the greater omentum. There was suture work holding the bag closed. Not surgical suture, just plain waxed thread, the kind you'd get at a hardware store. I stood there and looked at it for probably a full minute. My first thought, honestly, was that one of the students had pranked me. Then I remembered the students weren't back yet. Then I remembered the seal on the body bag had been intact when I opened it that morning, and I'd logged the number myself. I called my supervisor. His name was Peter. He came down from the office in his fleece vest, still holding his mug, and looked at the thing on the tray for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "Don't touch it again." He asked me to walk him through everything I'd done, step by step. I did. He nodded a lot. He wrote things down on the back of a printout. He asked if I'd taken any pictures. I hadn't. He told me not to. The thing on the tray had a small red LED on one edge that I hadn't seen at first because the overhead light was too bright. When Peter tilted the tray, I saw it. It was blinking, slow. About once every 4 seconds. That was the part that made me sit down on the stool by the sink. A battery in that thing had been running for at least 2 weeks, probably longer, inside a sealed body cavity. Whoever put it in there wanted it to stay on. Peter went upstairs to make phone calls. I sat there. The vents kept running. After maybe 20 minutes, I got up and washed my hands 3 times, even though I still had gloves on. Campus security showed up first. 2 guys, one of them younger than me, both of them clearly not sure what they were supposed to do. Then Minneapolis PD. Then someone in plain clothes who said he was with the Bureau's local field office but didn't hand me a card. I remember he had a twins lanyard around his neck, which struck me as strange, like he'd grabbed it off a hook to look casual on the way over. They asked me the same questions 3 times each. I answered the same way 3 times each. Yes, the bag was sealed. Yes, I logged the tag. No, I didn't have anyone else in the room. No, I didn't recognize the object. Yes, I understood I was not to discuss this with coworkers. Then the paperwork got weird. The donor file said the body had been received from a regional medical examiner's office the previous Thursday. Normal enough. But when someone pulled the man's actual death record, matched by tag number and dental, there was a funeral notice. Small one, in a paper out of a suburb west of the city. Closed casket service, 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks before he was ever wheeled into my lab. I heard Peter say into the phone, "That can't be right, run it again." And then a long pause, and then, okay. The family got a call that afternoon. I wasn't in the room. I heard about it later from a woman in the office who'd been asked to sit in. She said the son was on speakerphone. He kept asking them to repeat themselves. At one point he said, "We buried him. My mother was there. The casket was closed, but she saw him at the viewing the night before." He got quiet after that, and then he asked whether they were sure it was his father, and they had to tell him yes, they were sure, because the dental matched and the tag matched and everything on the intake matched. Nobody could explain the 2 weeks. Nobody could explain the chip either. It got bagged in one of those clear evidence pouches and left with the man in the twins' lanyard. I saw it once more, on his passenger seat, when he was walking back out to his car in the lot. The little red light was still going. That night I drove home the long way, sat in my car in the driveway for a while with the radio off. I didn't tell my girlfriend. I told her the shift ran late and I ate the reheated pasta and I went to bed. I remember lying there staring at the ceiling fan and trying to figure out at what point in the chain someone would have had the time and the privacy to do it. I couldn't come up with an answer. We didn't hear anything for about a month. Then Peter called me into his office and told me the case had been closed. That was the word he used, closed. He said the chip's contents were encrypted and the people who looked at it couldn't get inside. He said there was no evidence a crime had been committed on university property. He said the family had chosen not to pursue anything further, which I did not believe when he said it, and I do not believe now. I asked him what happened to the body. He said it had been released back to the family for reburial. I asked whether they'd opened the original casket, the one from 2 weeks before I ever met the man. He looked at me for a second, like he was deciding what he was allowed to say. Then he said, "That's not something I can discuss." I nodded and left. For the rest of that year, I worked inventory and cleaning. I asked to be taken off the prep rotation, and Peter didn't argue with me about it. He looked almost relieved. I spent the fall counting scalpel blades and restocking gowns and refilling the formalin drums. And it was fine. It was actually fine, because I did not have to open anything. The part I still can't work out isn't the chip. The chip was a machine. Machines get put places by people. Somebody, at some point in the chain of custody, opened that man up, put a small device in his abdomen, sewed him closed with hardware store thread, and passed him along. That's a person doing a thing. I can accept a person doing a thing. What I can't accept is the 2 weeks. Because either the family stood in a room in a funeral home the night before the service and looked at someone who wasn't him, or they looked at him and he came back. And I know how that second one sounds. I'm not saying it. I'm saying I've thought about it more than I want to. The last time I drove past that funeral home was on a work errand in November. It was already dark by 4 in the afternoon, the way it gets up there. Their sign out front had the wrong week on it. I don't know why I remember that. I just do.